I will be presenting today on From Sword to Sorcery, the medievalist juxtaposition of magic and might in Harry Potter. This is based on my dissertation that I wrote for my MSc in Medieval Literatures and Cultures at the University of Edinburgh, which obviously I chose partially for Harry Potter reasons. So the main research question I had here was, how does Harry Potter use medieval constructions of magic present in Arthurian romance to engage with issues of intellectual and emotional development and creative problem solving as an alternative to violence? So it's no secret that there are some elements of the medieval in Harry Potter. This has been recognized for a really long time. Some super early companion books pointing out that there are things that seem really recognizable that we're used to in medieval literature. So I just want to talk about the term medievalism or neo-medievalism for a moment. It's really not something that can be defined one way, and there are entire journals devoted just to trying to define the word medievalism. One of the earliest definitions says it's the continuing process of creating the Middle Ages. Umberto Eco uses the term neo-medievalism, specifically talking about the intentional reworking of the Middle Ages. Other people say it's just any kind of engagement with the Middle Ages, and we can see it in terms of tourism. People like to go visit these old castles. We see it in art and styles that people like to do. We see it so much in media, of course, in even fairs, medieval fairs and Renaissance fairs and all these aspects. So many different ways to work with it. So generally the definition I'm going to be working off of is just any kind of reception or reconstruction or recreation of the Middle Ages as we see it today. And this is a fairly new field, the idea of medievalism as how it's changing and evolving. So just to get us more of an idea of what medievalism is, people just shout out, if you hear the word medieval or Middle Ages, what are some ideas or images that come to mind? Feudalism. Anything else? Plague. Oh, God. King Arthur. Okay.
Hawking and falconry.
Sorry?
Hawking and falconry.
Oh, hawking and falconry. You guys are getting way more specific than I was expecting. And knights, okay. Chivalry. Dragons. Jousting. Coconuts. I did just have that image, didn't I? I walked into that one. So here are some that I came up with, and I think they generally fall mostly into two categories. One of those being war, and the other being magic. So some of these were said, and you guys got like really much deeper into the politics and concepts of falconry and feudalism as well. I was thinking the more general things like knights and swords and tournaments and honor and quests. And then the other side, dragons and fairies and dwarves and witches and warlocks. And in any of these lists, I think that the things that come up again and again are some kind of war or violence and some kind of supernatural beings or quests or objects. We see them constantly, and I think this is one reason that we associate the medieval with fantasy, which is potentially one of the most popular forms of medievalism. And for a lot of people, their first gateway into the medieval is not necessarily through looking at an actual piece of medieval artwork or reading an actual medieval story, but maybe seeing a Lord of the Rings movie or reading one of those kids' versions about King Arthur. So that's one reason that medievalism really impacts the way that we all see the medieval period, because we don't necessarily have a lot of direct contact with primary sources for most of us in our daily lives. It's some other type of way that it has been passed on to us. Now, specifically with fantasy being one of the most major aspects of medievalism, one reason would be that just there's so much magic in medieval literature. In medieval romance, it's a period that's inundated with these images of magic more so than other periods of literature, but also the literature and history itself leaves space to always be interpreted differently. Medievalism even started during the medieval period itself because so many stories were told in different ways. There's the French version of this one, the English version, the German version, and particularly with Arthurian tales being retold and adapted nonstop. And because there are these stories that have a lot to do with the very temporal matters of king and castle and country, but also, there are fairies and dragons, and how does the knight save his society by slaying a dragon? There's this balance between fantasy and reality that makes it feel in some ways grounded, in some ways, well, this is part of human history. There's something real here that we know about an actual war, an actual person, or an actual place, but it's mixed up with all of this mythology, particularly when we talk about the Arthurian. And of course, one of the major reasons that medieval is so associated with fantasy is thanks to J.R.R. Tolkien. He really is considered the father of modern fantasy as it is, and he was a medievalist, an Anglo-Saxonist in particular, and used that model that now led to what a lot of other people see as the default model. And even though magic is in all this fantasy, of course, even within fantasy stories, war is still what we expect in all medievalism. So here are images from a few probably familiar fantasy series that have a lot of violence in them. And Harry Potter is one that we do have a knightly image of him slaying a beast with a sword, but we see it in Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, Narnia. The main characters in those are not necessarily magical or don't have magical powers, even if they are mythical beings. They are fighting in battles. And this is something that's very common, and we don't even really question if there's fantasies, especially something medieval, there's going to be a battle against good and evil. So I want to talk about then how we view the magic versus the violence, or the magic in conjunction with the violence, and particularly looking at Arthurian literature. I'll be focusing mostly on Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, 15th century, which is already an adaptation, but one of the most expansive versions of the story that has so much packed into it that it's really a good way of looking at a large body of Arthurian material. So violence can function in two main ways, one being it's a tool that people consciously employ for particular purposes, for gaining power, gaining glory, for keeping the people in line, for serving justice. And therefore, because it serves all these purposes, it is the norm and it's glorious. And people don't really necessarily think that much about the people they're killing because it's all part of whatever mission they are on that is necessary. They are from the rival army, so you kill them. On the other hand, violence can also be very emotional and an impulse and something that can get out of hand very quickly, and this is particularly present in Malory, where there is a tragic structure, the kingdom falls at the end, and we see how violence gets out of hand. On the other hand, magic serves to temper violence. We conflate sword and sorcery in a lot of these things. There's going to be a battle and there's going to be magic as part of the battle, but they're quite separate and even at odds with each other in Arthurian literature. When we see it come out in Arthurian literature, we have the knights as the main characters, and then we have particular quests they go on or objects or enchanters that they meet who are educated, have the secret knowledge that no one else has. Maybe they have prophecies that they see visions, or they have dreams of the future. They know magical healing remedies, which is one way that they can directly counteract the effects of violence by healing people. The tests that they put forth to knights can test something that is other than their physical strength, which everything else is doing for them. They're looking at if they are pious and devoted, if they are honorable, if they're clever, if they have willpower and resilience, or good ethics. And it also gives them an opportunity to work through their feelings. While violence is either going ahead and acting because they're angry and they have to, or because it's their job and this is what they must do, things move more slowly when magic comes in. There's a chance to stop and think about what's going on. And this happens in a few different stories. Yvain in Chrétien de Troyes, and the Knight of the Cart, also Chrétien de Troyes, and a number of times we see in Malory, also in Gawain and the Green Knight. With all these working through emotions and seeing how violence works, there's a chance to critique the chivalry, the world of chivalry and the chivalric code, and how people go ahead and just use violence whenever they want. Now there's a chance to stop and think about it, which leads to magic being inherently subversive because it is challenging those conventions. It makes knights stop and think about things that they could do without thinking. And that's something that now comes to the forefront with Harry Potter. So a lot of the medievalist fantasy we see is set, like the Arthurian tales, in some kind of battle thing where our main characters, we have Aragorn, who is a great warrior, and most of the main characters of Game of Thrones, they're going out to battle, leading armies. But now we get a school as the main setting, and that leads to not necessarily throwing all of the medievalism out the window just because we're no longer in a medieval court, but just a refocusing. So instead of the knights being at the center, now we have the magicians who are usually on the fringes of Arthurian society who are the focal point now. They're not just there to serve some purpose for the knights, they are there to serve their own purpose, and we see what their own education might have been like. Rather than having a story about violence where there might be a chance to stop and think about things, now it's a story about scholars and kids going to school, doing peaceful things, just trying to get by, and suddenly Voldemort's banging down the door and trying to kill everybody. So it reframes violence. It's not something glorious, it's something that gets in the way of what should be mysteries. That's what we mostly have. It's all about using intelligence, using research, creativity, the resources. So the slow, steady, cumulative acquisition of knowledge, as Hopkins called it in a very early article in 2003. And it also shows that complex problems require complex solutions. I love this line so much, the great quip of Harry's, has anyone ever tried sticking a sword in Voldemort? Because it just seems so silly when Rufus Scrimgeour is questioning why would Dumbledore leave you this sword, and people make memes too about, oh, why doesn't Harry just, get a weapon and just go at Voldemort? Because it's more complicated than that. J.K. Rowling has set up a world in which you cannot solve your problems with violence. They're more difficult than that. Voldemort has taken measures, which also required deep study of finding restricted information about Horcruxes to make himself immortal. And this leads to trying to find other types of solutions. Now, in this, we have Harry becoming both the knight and the wizard. He is the hero. He is the one who has to undertake quests. He's doing tournaments. He's battling evil. He's slaying monsters. But at the same time, he's not a soldier, and he has a lot more that he can do to solve problems. Which leads to the question of whether magic should be used for violence, can be used for violence, how it interacts with violence. In both Arthurian literature and in Harry Potter, magic is based on intent and therefore it defines morality. There are examples of good and bad enchanters in Arthurian legend. The bad that most people know is Morgan Le Fay, who's always trying to mess with her brother. But then we have Merlin, who's always helping Arthur, and we have Nimue, who's a great friend to the Round Table. And it's not that magic is automatically, a great thing that helps all the knights or an evil thing that's trying to mess with the knights. It really depends on who is using it. Sometimes it even enables the knights to do violence. They give them a sword and say, here, have at it, and allows them to, yes, consider morals, but say, here, you can do violence, but for a good reason. T.H. White's The Once and Future King, an adaptation of Malory, discusses the idea of might for right. We're committing violence, but we're doing it for a good cause. We're doing it for a better society than the one that existed, and that makes it okay, but T.H. White questions whether it does. Whether or not magic itself is violent also depends on where the setting is in Arthurian literature, because when we see in Malory, most of this, a lot of Morgan being violent in her magic toward the court, and Merlin enabling Arthur to helping him with battle ideas, allowing Uther to rape under guise of being her husband, Arthur's mother, so that Arthur is born. They get involved in these dirty, violent politics as well, but in certain stories, like the Book of Merlin by Geoffrey of Monmouth, we see Merlin outside of the court, and in that scenario, he is building a counterculture. He's building this nice, peaceful society in the woods where all the magic people can learn about philosophy and plants and have this lovely society to themselves. And we see it with Morgan Le Fay as well. When she's not in a courtly society, she's a healer, she's benevolent. It's something that seems to be when magic is next to violence, it either reacts back with violence or enables the violence. But when it pulls back, it's not necessarily violence on its own and can be quite pure and peaceful. The magical quests as well make the knights reflect on their violence, but again, it depends on how. Sometimes it doesn't push them quite enough and makes them think about how they're using it, but not why they're using it. But in Harry Potter, every single spell requires thought about your intent and whether that intent will be reflected in what it is you do. So certain types of magic are prohibited, unforgivable curses, and you really need to meet them, as has been discussed in a few presentations already. It's not something you can just say, I'm mad, I'm gonna shoot this spell at someone and kill them or torture them. You can't do it. It takes such deep thought, and Horcruxes as well really need to search for that information. It's not something that you can just shoot off and say, whoops, I got really angry today and I made a Horcrux. Oh no. I did it 7 times, I got so angry. It's something you really, really have to want. So it implies that this is someone who's gone very much down a dark path and decided that for themselves. And it's not a viable option for someone who does not hold those kinds of values. So there's this idea that might cannot be used for right, because you have so many other options. Why use an unforgivable curse when you can easily use Expelliarmus? And this is something that Harry says in his values. I'm not going to start shooting people out of the sky, because that's what Voldemort does. So there's this idea that the means should reflect the ends, and this connects back again to subversion. Rosemary Jackson has a book called Fantasy, the Literature of Subversion. The idea that by portraying a reality different from our own, we are showing different possibilities and therefore inherently subverting and challenging the way things are, saying, well, why should they be this way if we can imagine them this way? Why should it be the only way to defeat evil is using violence of your own if there's maybe a possibility of doing it another way? And for Harry Potter, that's magic, but for us, it could be science, innovation, technology, philosophy, any number of things that challenge us to think, is violence really the best we can do? In thinking about is violence the best we can really do, it's important to look inside and discover that for ourselves. So this is also taken from Arthurian literature, where there are all these examples of the knights being made to look into themselves when encountering magic. A big example is Gawain and the Green Knight. Gawain is not really doing much battle in this story. He is going to a castle and hanging out and having some tests that involve not physical strength, but how he reacts to a woman and to his host and the gifts that he is given. And it's about his chivalry not in how he fights, but in his honesty and whether he's willing to sacrifice himself, in his loyalty. Different kinds of values that are coming out and showing how worthy he truly is. And we see here a number of different aspects of magic in Harry Potter that reflect some kind of looking inward. Sorting Hat and people's personalities, Dementors and depression and fear, Boggarts, and then the humor required to make a Boggart funny, the Mirror of Erised and what your deepest desires are, and of course Patronus's and how you overcome depression and fear. Another big one on magical introspection is in objects and the idea of who is worthy. An obvious one is Excalibur, and also the sword of Gryffindor. You must be the bravest, the most worthy in order to obtain the sword. But then how they use the sword is important. I think it's significant that no person is ever killed with the sword of Gryffindor. Snakes are killed, but no people. Snakes and snake objects, the locket. Whereas Excalibur is used in war a lot, and Arthur gets Excalibur at the same time that he gets a scabbard that serves an important defensive purpose of stopping him from losing blood. And Merlin asks him, which one do you prefer, the scabbard or the sword? And Arthur says, well, I mean, the sword. And Merlin says, well, that's kind of foolish because the scabbard could keep you alive. A sword, sure, it's a really good sword, but this scabbard has this very important defensive purpose. And to me, that reflects the Deathly Hallows a little bit, of is it the cloak or the wand? The Elder Wand is this great weapon, but the cloak can keep you safe from death in a different way, that defensive purpose. And it is important, I believe, that Harry chooses not to pursue the Hallows and ends up becoming Master of Death anyway, where Arthur says, oh, I love the sword so much. He ends up losing the scabbard. He ends up losing the sword. He gets it back again, but he loses it again because he fails that test of which one he really should value. The Grail is another example of who is worthy. And we see basically almost all the knights fail in the quest for the Holy Grail, other than 3 select knights. One of them is Galahad, and as soon as he gets it because he is the most worthy, he basically dies and ascends to the heavens and is taken away by the angels, kind of like how Cedric Diggory is the purest, achieves the Triwizard Cup, and immediately dies. And each of those scenarios also shows the corruption happening in the worlds around them. Everyone else who fails to get the Grail, it shows, oh, all of these knights are not as holy as they say. And when the Triwizard Tournament goes to disaster, we start to see all the corruption within the ministry, people not believing Harry, the Death Eaters coming out from behind closed doors. And it's a chance to look at what's happening here, and we see in Order of the Phoenix, not everyone reacts very well to all of this new news coming out. So the question then becomes, who is self-aware, and can they change? Are they able to recognize their flaws? For a lot of characters in Harry Potter, yes, they move on. There is a happy ending at the end. But in Arthurian literature, I would say no, they fail to do so. Lancelot realizes that his he realizes that his affair with Guinevere is something that is stopping him from getting the Grail, stopping him from being as holy as he possibly can. And he keeps going back to Guinevere anyway. Gawain is told time and time again he's too murderous, he's too rash, he is too full of vengeance and ready to attack anyone for the slightest insult. And he recognizes that, he keeps getting told that, and he continues to do it. And how they act on their emotions is a major, major part of both series. Works, although Arthurian literature does feel like one giant series, which is filled with ubiquitous violence. And when we have violence all over the place, it's a desensitizing factor. It desensitizes the narrator, the characters, and the readers. The characters go ahead and do whatever they want. They don't feel anything for their victims. So why bother holding yourself back if you don't feel bad? The moments that we do see someone feel bad is when they usually show mercy. A certain knight will see the face of someone or realize the other person's not so bad, they were just doing what they were told, and they let them go. When they allow themselves to feel, there is more of a chance of stopping violence. At the same time, if they feel too much, it leads to rash behavior. Gawain, I think, being the primary example of that. And Gawain, especially, is one of the main factors in the downfall of Camelot. He is so angry at Lancelot over accidentally killing his brothers that he insists on vengeance, even though it's bad for the kingdom, and wants to go after him. And this is what happens almost every time that someone wants vengeance in Arthurian literature, and particularly in Malory. It's immediately acting. We don't get a lot of emotional descriptions within Arthurian literature, particularly Malory. It's a lot of, oh, and there was much woe, and then he went and killed him. Emotion is encountered as an aspect of behavior. They are one and the same. That is the only way these people really express emotion. It might say there was made great dole or some weeping, but we see it move directly to action. Whereas in Harry Potter, Harry sometimes tries to act immediately on his emotions, but a lot of the time we only get a few deaths, and they're all very, very deep and sad. There's time for Harry to stop and reflect, and each one makes the narration takes it very seriously, the characters take it very seriously, and the readers do. I think we all remember, if you're of the right age, when the books were coming out and you knew one person would die each book, starting by number 4. It was Cedric, and that was painful, then Sirius, and that was painful, and Dumbledore, and that was painful, and then Deathly Hallows just destroyed us all. But it was still, even all this, even Hedwig, we get this deep moment of what it means to lose someone, and that grief is very present and showing us this is a real problem. It's not something we can just write off as, oh, and a whole bunch of knights died that day. Each single death is painful. So I think what happens here again with emotion is tying in of the knights and the enchanters. The knights are supposed to have this strength of feeling. Out of measure is a phrase that's used again and again. He was wrath out of measure. She was sad out of measure all the time. But Morgan Le Fay is described as being able to control her emotions, and that's seen as being kind of manipulative, that she can do it. But for J.K. Rowling, being able to confront, understand, and moderate emotions is a good thing. You should feel strongly, but also be able to talk about those emotions and then put them into action with nonviolent methods of magic. So I love this scene where Harry is digging Dobby's grave, and he feels that he learns control at last when he decides not to go for the Hallows, realizes that Horcruxes are important, and his grief for Dobby overwhelms Voldemort's anger, and he does not let Voldemort in. Which of course ties to my final point on love. In Arthurian literature, there's a lot of love, and it's often quite bad, in that it motivates people to be violent, either to impress their ladies or to get vengeance for family members who have been wronged or killed. Whereas in Harry Potter, it is immediately a defense against violence. It protects Harry with his mother's love. It protects him when he loves Sirius to stop Voldemort from possessing him. Even Narcissa Malfoy and Snape, their love stops them from serving Voldemort any longer because they are capable of an emotion he is not. And again, the means reflect the ends. Love in Arthurian literature can sometimes mean you're going to kill for love. In Harry Potter, love does not work with killing. They are incompatible. There must be another way to express love, to express a positive emotion in a way that is nonviolent. So just finally, the questions that I want to put out to the room are, does neo-medievalism have a continuing place in the fantasy canon, particularly when a lot of these early depictions were from wartime writers, when violence was, of course, on the mind, people were being drafted, and maybe that's not the case so much anymore, where war is a part of most Western teens' daily lives. And magic, instead of violence, provides a lot of opportunity to talk about things in so many different settings. It doesn't have to be a school, it doesn't have to be a battlefield, it doesn't even have to be medieval, as Harry Potter is not, it just has echoes of it. It can be anywhere and can test any kind of emotion, any kind of value, and be changed for any time period. I think it's significant to note that the enchantresses are the characters who survive Le Morte d'Arthur when basically all the other knights die. The magic is what continues to survive and to live on another day when knights will keep dying out. So it provides maybe the idea that there is a hopeful future, that it doesn't have to end in tragedy for everyone if we can find other ways of acting other than through violence. Thank you.